5 of the worst wartime betrayals in history. In war, knowing who you can trust is one of the most vital factors for survival, whether on the battlefield or inside a war room. When that trust is broken, the consequences can be catastrophic, sending shockwaves far beyond personal grievances and reshaping the course of entire wars and even human history itself. Across thousands of years, there have been moments when decisions made during wartime can only be described as profound betrayals of comrades, alliances, and even one's own country. One of the most controversial examples is the attack on Mers-el-Kébir. The story begins shortly after Dunkirk in 1940. The French army had suffered devastating losses, and by June 7th, German forces were less than 70 miles from Paris. As defeat loomed, the likelihood that France might seek an armistice with the Axis powers became increasingly clear. This possibility alarmed the remaining allies, especially Britain. France possessed one of the largest and most powerful navies in the world, a fleet that played a crucial role in countering Axis sea power. The question was unavoidable. What would happen if that fleet fell into German hands? Losing it would be a massive blow, but allowing it to strengthen the enemy could spell disaster for Britain itself. Even before France formally considered leaving the war, discussions had already begun among British leadership. Admiral François Darlan, commander of the French fleet, attempted to calm British fears. He insisted the fleet would never be surrendered to Germany, and promised that orders would be given to scuttle the ships if capture became unavoidable. In Britain, the War Cabinet met and reached a hard conclusion. They agreed France should only be allowed to sign an armistice if the French fleet was moved to British ports before negotiations began. However, this plan posed serious risks. French North Africa would be left vulnerable to retaliation, and Premier Paul Reynaud was unwilling to accept that danger. Negotiations continued back and forth between the two governments. Eventually, Reynaud resigned after yet another British proposal was rejected by his cabinet. Admiral Darlan remained firm, arguing that Britain would not survive the German advance, and stating that he had not created the French fleet simply to hand it over to the British. Despite this, assurances were once again sent to Britain, repeating the promise that the fleet would never be allowed to fall into German hands. Winston Churchill, however, was unwilling to rely on promises alone. As a result, Britain began seriously considering another option: destroying the French fleet themselves. Meanwhile, Adolf Hitler understood that the French would never agree to include their navy in any armistice terms. Instead, he proposed that the fleet remain in Axis-controlled ports, officially removed from active combat and out of the war effort. The armistice was signed on June 22, 1940. With that, Britain faced a grim reality and moved forward with what became known as Operation Catapult. Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville was appointed to lead the operation. His mission was to sail to Mers-el-Kébir, where a significant portion of the French fleet was stationed. Somerville was instructed to present the French commanders with 4 options. First, sail the ships to British ports and continue fighting alongside Britain. Second, sail to British ports with the option of eventual repatriation. Third, sail to French ports in the West Indies and have the ships fully demilitarized. And fourth, if all else failed, sink the fleet. The French admiral refused, deeply regretful, yet fully aware of the betrayal that was unfolding. With no remaining alternatives, British Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville issued the order to open fire at 5:54 p.m. on July 3rd. It marked the first time Britain and France had fired upon one another since the Battle of Waterloo. At the same moment, more than 200 French warships and naval support vessels were seized in British home ports. 15 minutes after the barrage began, Somerville ordered a ceasefire. He informed the French commanders that unless he could clearly see ships sinking, he would have no choice but to resume the attack. During the confusion, however, one French battleship managed to escape an operational failure on Somerville's part. This mistake led to additional British attacks over the next 3 days. The consequences of this British betrayal were immediate. France severed diplomatic relations and responded with a symbolic bombing of Gibraltar. British newspapers described the action as terrible, yet unavoidable. Winston Churchill delivered a powerful but not entirely accurate speech to the House of Commons, claiming Britain had secured most of the French fleet and asserting that a battlecruiser had attempted to place itself under German control. By July 6th, the toll was devastating. 1,297 French officers were dead or missing, and another 351 were wounded. In private letters to his wife, Somerville expressed deep anguish over his role, calling the operation the greatest political mistake of modern times, and fuming that he had been selected to carry out what he described as such a miserable task. The Battle of Hong Kong. In 1941, Britain requested that Canada send 2 additional battalions to reinforce Hong Kong. At the time, it is possible that the man who proposed the idea, Major General Arthur Gracett, did not possess the full intelligence available to higher authorities. Despite Allied occupation, the growing likelihood that the Far East would soon be drawn into the war was becoming increasingly clear. Another figure almost certainly understood this risk. Chief of the Canadian General Staff, Harry Crerar. Despite having access to high-level British communications that should have raised serious warnings, Crerar assured the King that the deployment posed no military danger. That assurance set in motion a decision that would ultimately betray some of Canada's most vulnerable soldiers. Crerar was provided with a list of battalions by Brigadier J.K. Lawson, categorized into Class A, B, and C units. Lawson strongly advised against selecting troops from Class C units that lacked sufficient training, required refresher instruction, or were deemed unfit for combat operations. To his credit, Crerar explored other options. However, 9 out of 10 Class A battalions were already scheduled for overseas deployment. In Class B, 4 units belonged to a newly formed division, while 3 were assigned to coastal defense duties. By process of elimination, Crerar appeared to have few alternatives. The Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles of Canada, both volunteer units from Class C, were ultimately chosen to form the newly created C Force. Crerar later justified the decision by claiming he wanted representation from both Eastern and Western Canada, and that the units had recently performed similar roles, making them supposedly familiar with the conditions. The reality was far harsher. These soldiers lacked proper training, had little combat experience, and were inadequately equipped. As one Royal Rifles soldier later recalled, "We were just kids." Nevertheless, war was coming. On December 7th, reports of enemy movement along the border placed the 6 battalions defending Hong Kong on full alert. Later that same day, the Japanese launched their attack. Brigadier Lawson, who had accompanied the troops to Hong Kong, attempted to rally his men. But according to the Winnipeg Grenadiers themselves, defeat was inevitable. With such limited experience and preparation, they never stood a real chance. Over the following weeks, Japanese forces systematically overwhelmed the defenders. Brigadier Lawson was killed in the fighting, becoming the highest-ranking Canadian officer to die during the Second World War. Even wounded soldiers were shown no mercy, as Japanese troops stormed a hospital and bayoneted men as they lay helpless in their beds. The Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles of Seaforce should never have been deployed to Hong Kong. It is widely accepted that they should not have been placed in that position at all. Their deployment represented a betrayal of soldiers who trusted their country to protect them and act in their best interests. Instead, they were sent directly into danger without the training, equipment, or support needed to survive. By the end, 290 Canadian soldiers were dead, and another 493 were wounded. Benedict Arnold. Few names in American history carry the weight of betrayal like Benedict Arnold. in one of the most infamous acts of treachery ever recorded. The high-ranking Revolutionary War officer turned against his fellow Americans, passing critical intelligence to the British. He was already in contact with Hitler, or at the very least with senior figures within Hitler's inner circle. In December 1939, Vidkun Quisling met Hitler in person for the first time. Seizing the moment, Quisling revealed his ultimate ambition: to unite what he believed were the superior Germanic nations. On April 9, 1940, Germany invaded Norway. This decision followed multiple meetings, including discussions with Quisling, who provided intelligence on Norwegian military positions. Ultimately, however, it was the actions or lack of action by Norway's own government that created the opening Quisling needed. Despite receiving advance warnings of the invasion, the government's response was weak. They rejected Germany's ultimatum, and along with the royal family, fled Oslo rather than remaining behind to control the country's administrative centers. In doing so, they declared Oslo an open city, hoping to avoid the kind of devastating bombardment that had destroyed Warsaw. While this decision may have spared Oslo from heavy shelling, it also left the city exposed. German forces quickly seized key government buildings throughout the capital with Quisling's cooperation. With no authority remaining to oppose him, Quisling moved swiftly. Backed by Hitler, he announced the formation of a new government under his leadership later that same day. Unfortunately for Quisling, Hitler's representative in Norway, German Reich Special Envoy, Joseph Terboven, was far from impressed. The failure to capture Norway's king meant there was no way to legitimize a pro-Nazi government led by Quisling. Terboven was left managing a chaotic political situation, and there was clear hostility between the envoy and the deeply unpopular Quisling. Over the following days, Quisling attempted to solidify his grip on power, but his efforts quickly unraveled. He lacked public support, and even the ministers he appointed refused to serve. His attempted coup collapsed almost as quickly as it began. Hitler recognized the importance of keeping Quisling aligned with the Nazi cause, but also saw that direct intervention was necessary. Instead of backing Quisling outright, Hitler appointed Joseph Terboven as head of Norway's government. Quisling was given a so-called reserve role allowed to remain involved, but stripped of any real authority or decision-making power. Even so, Quisling continued to openly support the Nazi occupation, further enraging the Norwegian public. Under Terboven's leadership, Quisling's party National Samling steadily lost influence. By 1942, Hitler had lost interest entirely and ceased corresponding with the failed politician, despite Quisling's continued efforts to promote Nazi ideology. After the war, Quisling finally faced consequences for his betrayal of Norway. He was sentenced to death. The Sack of Constantinople, 1204. Nearly 1,000 years ago, the Sack of Constantinople took place, an event still regarded as one of the greatest betrayals in history, with consequences that continue to be felt and debated today. When Pope Innocent III called for the Fourth Crusade, his stated goal was to reclaim the Holy Lands from Islamic control and restore them to what he believed was their rightful Christian authority. In reality, however, the crusade turned against the Orthodox Greek Christians of the Byzantine Empire, shocking act that betrayed their shared faith. It is often claimed that Pope Innocent III was unaware of the Crusaders' true intentions. By this time, tensions between Orthodox and Western Christians had been building for over 2 centuries. Deep theological differences had fostered mistrust and resentment, with each side viewing the other through deeply biased perspectives. So when the Fourth Crusade set sail in 1202, it did so with advanced naval technology and an army heavily supported by Venice, a city-state that had its own grievances with Constantinople after previously being expelled from the city. The Crusaders soon encountered a serious problem. Only about 1/3 of the expected forces arrived. As a result, they were unable to pay the Venetians for ships and supplies. In response, the Crusades' leader, Doge Enrico Dandalo, made a decision that would permanently stain his legacy. Under his command, the Crusaders attacked Zara, a Christian city under Hungarian control. When Pope Innocent III learned of this, he was furious. He declared the entire crusade excommunicated and denounced the attack as a betrayal of Christian values. Although this punishment was later lifted for the French Crusaders, it remained in place for the Venetians. The situation grew even more unstable when Prince Alexios Angelos entered the picture. Claiming to be the rightful heir to the Byzantine throne, he convinced the Crusaders to help restore him to power in Constantinople. Some Crusaders opposed this plan and chose to abandon the expedition entirely. In 1203, the Crusaders entered Constantinople and succeeded in placing Alexios on the throne. However, he failed to deliver on the promises he had made in return for their support. His popularity quickly collapsed, and he was eventually assassinated. Still camped outside the city walls, the Crusaders made a fateful decision. They launched another assault on Constantinople, capturing the city on April 12, 1204. What followed was a brutal sack, widespread looting, slaughter, and the assault of civilians as the city was desecrated. By May 16, 1204, a Latin emperor was installed in Constantinople. Rather than liberating holy lands, the Crusaders had crushed the Greek Orthodox Christians who had long held the city, replacing them with a Catholic stronghold. These actions directly contributed to the long-term decline of Christianity in the East. The bitterness and sense of betrayal created by the Sack of Constantinople lingered for centuries, and divisions between Christian denominations born from these events still endure today. History often remembers wars by their victories and defeats, but just as often they are shaped by betrayal. Not by enemies across the battlefield, but by allies, leaders, and institutions that were trusted the most. From shattered alliances to catastrophic decisions made behind closed doors, these betrayals didn't just change battles. They altered the course of nations, faiths, and entire civilizations. And perhaps the most unsettling question remains. In war, is betrayal an exception or an inevitability? This has been history in a nutshell. If you want more moments where history turns on a single broken trust, make sure to like, subscribe, and join us for the next story.